A great wave of water crashed against my face as I held my hands out, trying to block the incoming water that threatened to drown me. I could vaguely hear Dylan's laughing over the splashing tides that were thrown forth from his cupped hands as he crashed them against the surface of the water in an attempt to shower me in the cold contents of the pool. Realizing my attempts to deflect the water was pointless, I began flailing my arms in retaliation, splashing my own currents of water in his direction. After choking down a few liters of chlorinated water in laughter, we came to a mutual halt and clambered onto the side of the pool to rest our stinging eyes from the venomous antibacterial chemicals in the water. "I think I won that," Dylan said, as he sat on the concrete edges of his feet, swaying back and forth in the pool, still splashing its contents into the air. "Yeah, won at drinking the most water," I retorted, kicking my foot up from the water to douse him one final time. Another all-out splashing war almost erupted on the side of the pool, until I put my hands up and admitted defeat, not wanting to hear from my sister how all the pool water went missing as a result of our frenzy. "Are you gonna play football again?" Dylan asked, as he lightly kicked around the water, fighting the urge to rupture its pleasant waking surface. "No," I told him, and was interrupted before I could say more. "Why not? You're the one who got me into it." Dylan turned himself to face me, upset over the idea that I would leave him to play on his own. "I won't be able to," I told Dylan, finding it hard to explain. "I have something I gotta do." "Like what?" Dylan asked with a curious look, wondering why he wasn't there by my side doing whatever it was I spoke of. "I don't know," I told him, finding no better way of putting it. "Just keep playing, though, without me." "Why? It is pointless without you." "No, it isn't. Dylan, I paused, looking for the right words. I'm not always going to be there. Sometimes you have to do things on your own." "Seriously, keep playing. Never quit." We sat silently, kicking back and forth the water in the pool, watching the shimmering reflection of the sun atop its dancing surfaces. "And you don't have to be afraid of them," I added. "Afraid of who?" Dylan asked back, playing dumb. "Billy and all of them," I said. "Who said I am afraid of them?" I looked over at him as though it was completely apparent. Dylan made an irritable throaty noise at me. "I hate your ability to read minds," he mentioned. "It can be really annoying." "I know," I told him, feeling the exact same way about it. "Well, I gotta get ready," Dylan said as he climbed up from his seated position along the side of the pool. He walked over to the lawn chairs parked in the shade of the house and grabbed a towel off of the nearest one, wrapping it around himself as he began packing his backpack full of the thrown-about school clothing that he was originally wearing when he came off the bus. "My mom should be over any minute," he remarked, as he threw the sling of his bag over his shoulder and began walking over to the front side of my house. I got up and ran to his side, walking with him to the front side of the building. We sat on the front porch of my house until his mother arrived to pick him up, bringing her bright smile and over-friendly personality with her. Dylan gave a nonchalant goodbye with the expectations of seeing me the following day in school. All I did was wave as he drove away down the long driveway of my house, on his way back to his home. I whispered goodbye as though we would see each other again the following day, in the crowded hallways of our school, or in the midst of our gym class, or perhaps in the long, ruthless lines of the lunchroom, or seated at the round tables gobbling down flavorless chicken nuggets. Maybe even in the back seat of the bus, the one we had fought so hard to keep for ourselves, or even in the tides of my backyard pool, where we splashed free of the burdens of parental rule, and where Dylan's wishful thoughts of catching my sister in a bikini plagued my consciously perceptive mind. None of those would happen again, and I dreaded the very thought. I got up and pushed open the front door to my house, walking into the scarcely used entry hall where Kristin was just a room away, frolicking around with her new boyfriend. "Ew," I said casually, looking into the living room where Sean and Kristin were seated a little too close for leisure company. "Oh, shut up," Kristin said as she jumped up out of Sean's arms and ran into the kitchen, trying to escape my unwanted opinion. "Bro!" Sean shouted, spreading his arms out in wonder as to why I would do such a thing, as to interrupt an important moment for him. I smiled back, following my sister into the kitchen, as Sean's attention was soon lost into the midst of the television screen that showed replays of professional football games. Kristin was shuffling through cabinets anxiously, as though looking for something of great importance. With her veil, I was unable to read her thoughts, but it was clear to me she was busy thinking of something else, and not the contents of the cabinet she was juggling around. "You going somewhere?" I asked, having briefly skimmed Sean's thoughts during my short time in the living room. "Yeah," she said. "We're going out, so don't do anything stupid while I'm gone, because I still don't know where your father is, so I'm going to have to leave you alone. Unless you want a babysitter?" "No," I shouted, knowing she was just trying to consort me into behaving well. "And go to bed on time. You still have school tomorrow, and I don't want you to having trouble getting up, just because I won't be around to tell you to." "Okay, I know," I said, cutting her short, before she collapsed from the lack of breath in her lungs, as she spoke the words out frantically, likely a sign of her nervousness from anticipating her first date with Sean. "Good," she said, looking at me to see if I'd break a smile at the thought of disobeying her orders. Instead, I ran into her, embracing her into my arms and feeling the all-too-powerful dampening effects of her ring. "Derek, what the hell?" she asked, wondering why it was that I spontaneously hugged her. I hesitated. "I just love you," I told her, knowing it was my only time to tell her. "Right," she said, pulling me off of her as she walked across the kitchen without further regard for my actions. "I need to get ready now. You and Sean behave," she said, pointing a firm finger in my direction, as though I was some kind of instigator. I rolled my eyes as she retreated off to her room, for what would probably be 15 intense minutes of putting on globs of makeup and masking scents while fitting into unusually tight and promiscuous clothing. I watched her as she walked away, trying to recall the one moment I had actually connected with my sister. It was the time when she had removed her ring, and I felt her affection in full force, for the first time, as though she was really there, and not locked behind some shield invisible to the human eye. It was a moment I tried to remember, as I wanted to feel it again this very moment, as I fear this might be the last time I ever got to see her again. Sean was calling out to me. "Hey, bro," said Sean, as he was seated comfortably on my couch, with his feet up on the entertainment table, which normally Kristin would yell at me for doing. He was wearing his football jersey, which was oversized even for his large build, as it was intended to be worn over a thick set of shoulder pads. His jeans were baggy too, to complement the excessive bulk of his jersey. "You gotta give me some tips, like, what is your sister like? What's her favorite color? Her favorite food? That kind of thing." I looked out of the corner of my eyes at him, as though to suggest that he stood no chance in getting any such information out of me, and I started walking off to my room, when he called out to me, "Come on, bro, you can't leave a brother hanging like this." When I turned around, he was standing up, his arms in the air as if he was chanting wildly at a competitive football game, and looked at me with solemn eyes as though I was abandoning him in his time of need. I walked over to him. "Sit down." Sean immediately fell into the couch, looking up at me with an intense degree of focus. "Say that you will listen to everything that I say," I commanded, as Sean sat back, mumbling the words quickly with a dumbfounded look about him. He bobbed his head up and down at me at my every word thereafter. "You are not going to hug her, you're not going to kiss her, you're not going to marry her, and you're not going to hold her hand," I spoke firmly, like an angry father to his daughter's first boyfriend. I stepped back at the sound of my own voice, worried Kristin would have heard every word I had said. Sean stared up at me, with his jaw dropped and his mind blank, taking in every word I said with an absolute literal meaning, and inscribing it into his subconscious brain centers without any chance of defiance. "And be nice," I told him, as he gave one final nod right before Kristin came jogging back down from the second-story stairs. "All right," Kristin said, reaching the bottom of the stairs and breathing out a sigh of relief, as though it took great effort to squeeze into the tight set of pants she was wearing. "Well, we're going," she said, as she walked over to Sean, who still looked up at me in amazement, and she grabbed onto his hand to pull him up from the couch. Sean drew back his hand in fright, gripping it with his other hand as though it was stung by a bee. He remembered my orders clearly. "Sean, get up," my sister demanded, wondering why he reacted to her touch like that. Sean slowly rose from the seat, as though in a daze, and my sister dragged him towards the back door, trying to quicken their departure, as she didn't want to risk the chance of me ruining her perfectly planned evening. "See you, bro," was all Sean had said, as he was hauled out of my house by my sister. The two got into their car and left, to do whatever it was they had planned that night. It wasn't a big concern for me, as I knew Sean was a far better boyfriend than anything Kristin had previously, but I really wasn't sure I'd get to be there to see how it all turns out. I just wanted to make sure that she would be alright. I grinned, recalling the short lecture I had given Sean, knowing well that his athletic mindset so prone to heeding the orders of enlightening coaches, would abide by my every word. I just hoped that I had covered everything. I mean, what else do adults do on first dates? I walked my way back through the silent house, looking out the living room windows out into the sepia sky where the sun slowly lowered its way to the horizon. Bright pink clouds floated overhead as they caught the final glimpse of the sun before the blazing star retired for the remainder of the evening. I was wondering if I should say goodbye to this sight as well. Would I ever get to see it again after I finally went through with this? The house was silent but for the faint echo of emotions that howled down the end of the long hallway leading to the first floor bedrooms. I walked its length, pressing my hands against the white walls, feeling the grooves under the paint and the many lives that have been pressed into the inanimate surface. I had lived all my life here, and I knew of no other place I could call home. The seams, the walls, and the structures of the buildings had all played witness to my life, and had been there by my side. I loved my home, but I had to give it a goodbye. My father's room was at the end of the hall, and I slowly made my way to it, dragging my feet on the rug, and a sense of euphoria, feeling its familiar surface, taking it in one final time. The door at the end of the hall was nearly alive, radiant with astral colors that spoke of endless tales of entry and exits. I turned its round golden handle until I heard a click. It was locked. It was to be expected. My father had always locked his door, and it had been some time since I've been inside his room. I knew how to open it. I just never wanted to. Never had a reason. But without my father being here, I had no way of speaking to him. No way of saying goodbye. I pressed a little paperclip into the tiny hole within the door handle and listened as the lock disengaged. When I opened the door, it was like opening a sealed vault from an ancient Egyptian tomb. A vast current of air flowed over me, carrying old winds of energy that had long since vanished from the rest of the house. I shivered as I felt it. The incoming energy was filled with an overbearing sense of negativity, hopelessness, and despair. I pushed the terrible thoughts from my mind, and they faded like mist, without substance as its bearer was not present. I continued on, slowly walking into the room as though pressing against strong wind currents that carried past lingering emotions. I took in everything as though for the first time, realizing I really had never taken a conscious realization of what lay dormant in my father's bedroom. A large-sized mattress covered the center of the floor. The sheets were riled and thrown about wildly, as though its occupants suffered nights of disturbing sleep. At the end of the bed was a cabinet pressed against the wall, the top portion carrying an album worth of photographs, all held within the confines of expensive and preserving picture holders. Every picture in the embezzling line of the frames was of my mother. The room was a mess as things were thrown and scattered about without care. The room was like that of a teenager. His clothes layered the floor along with broken portions of a vacuum cleaner. Cups, glasses, and empty beer cans all accompanied the ground in a lazy display of disregard. The only thing that remained untouched were the pictures of my mother, and they were everywhere, placed perfectly out of reach of the chaos that littered the grounds. On the walls were more photographs, taped aggressively and bound in lamination along with old handwritten letters my mother had long ago wrote my father. She was everywhere, at every turn. Any object that sat unblemished was once hers, now a sacred object to my father, and its very surface was to remain in perfection, the way it had always been. I spun around, finding an unnatural number of objects dedicated to her. The room spoke strangely of worship. My mother was a deity to my father, and all his energy and all of his character was thrown into these objects, of what he regarded as indispensable value. A full-sized picture of her sat at the top, around the center of the cupboard, that was placed at the foot end of the bed, directly in the eyesight of any sleeping occupant within the bed. She was beautiful. That I could understand. But why did my father live in regret? Why did he surround himself with the past and refuse to move on? I grabbed a hold of a frame, placing my hands on each end with great care. I knew had my father seen me holding the photograph, he would have been very upset. I could feel its over-meticulous care for the object, his excessive effort to preserve it in the past state. It was almost sickening, a characteristic to him I had never known of. Then he arrived home. I thought I could feel him. Holding onto the picture, I began to feel the presence of my father and his usual drunken thoughts had collided into mine. For a curious moment, I thought I might have brought his conscious thoughts to me, from wherever he was in the world, all the way to where I was. I wondered why I could hear him, as though he was closely by, and that was when I heard his car pulling into the driveway. Carefully placing the picture back where it was, I ran out of the room, closing the door behind me and sliding into the kitchen door, waiting for his sudden arrival. I had feared that I would not get to see him, that I would not be able to hold him one last time, as I had planned. But it all had changed. As though in perfect timing, my final farewell could be delivered. The side door slammed open and a strange, powerful feeling overcame me. I bent over, clutching my stomach as though I had an unusual need to vomit. I held on tightly, resting his urges as my father walked into the kitchen, rambling to himself, minding no attention to me as I kneeled down in a terrible, sickened state. "Fucking bastards. Thinks he can get me? That freak. Come on out of the shadows and try and kill me. Sabotage my car, steal my identity, I will screw you a lot harder than you could screw me," my father shouted to the air, as he paced violently through the kitchen. Most of his words were incoherent, and he turned sporadically, flinging his fists into the air as though somebody was bound to attack him at any moment. I was rising from the ground, grabbing onto the dining table to leverage myself. I was resisting the ailment with every urge, fighting the terrible sensation that gripped at my stomach, knowing I could overthrow it with enough concentration. My father's unexpected behavior flew over me, and I hardly took notice as I tried hard to dispel the growing discomfort in my gut. My legs were quivering, as though they were too weak to carry me, and I sat as still as possible, as even the movement caused by the quaking floor from my father's footsteps greatly worsened the feeling. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, nearly startling me. If only I wasn't so focused on standing up. I still managed to look over at him, collapsing my head onto the table as I turned my sight in his direction. He was staring out the front window of the house, rambling a series of paranoid statements, still failing to recognize that I was there in the kitchen, struggling to overcome a terrible and sudden sickness. He punched his fist into the window, causing a giant crack to form at its center, and then he turned off, careless of his destruction as he marched off to his room with a battered fist. The sickness had faded enough that I could now recompose myself, and I stared at the back of my father in confusion as I tried to realize what had just happened. As he grew in distance, the sickening feeling diminished, and at his weakened state, I managed to filter it out and block its influence completely. My father had no bags or belongings of any sorts that he would have normally carried back into the house from his long business trip, but he was still dressed in his formal clothing, which I assumed he would have long retired from wearing after his trip was over. With all due haste, as though something of a much more important matter was at his attention, he rushed off and opened the door to his room, stopping before he entered. He looked down at the handle as though something was terribly wrong, realizing he had opened the door without needing to unlock it. "Why was my door unlocked? Who the fuck?" he returned. He turned around to face me. "Was it you, boy? Did you break into my room?" "No, yes," I said, unwilling to lie to my father, yet feeling a sense of fear from him that I had never felt before. "You fucking brat," he shouted, slamming the door against the wall, shaking the house in its force. "I will have you for that." My father crashed his feet down hard with every step as he marched his way to me, as though I was a person he had long sought for revenge. My eyes widened as sheer terror seized up into my throat, and I was unable to speak. I ran behind the kitchen table, trying to find something to stand in the way of my father, as 1,000 unfiltered and uncontrollable thoughts overcame me. I couldn't decipher which ones were mine and which ones were his, as his terrible hostile tone rattled my bones and my legs clattered, threatening to collapse under my weight. "Are you working with him? Is that what you are doing?" My father made outrageous claims, speaking of things I could not possibly comprehend. Even after attempting to gaze into his uncontrollable, gushing thoughts, I could not find who it was he spoke of. All I saw was a shade. A red, furious glow pulsated out from behind him as he charged at me, and my every attempt to penetrate his thoughts and demand that he halter left me with a searing, burning sensation at the front of my head. When he reached the table, he latched his hands onto its brim, gripping it with enough pressure to cause his knuckles to swell red, and he shoved the table into me, trying to pin me against the far corner. I ducked under the table, following the sliding furniture back to the counter as my father continued to push it across the room. When the table hit the wall, he crouched, looking underneath at my cowering form, and swept his hands in my direction to try and get a hold of me. I climbed frantically out of one of the unguarded sides, and my father chased me into the living room. I fought him with all my psychic might, lashing at him with thoughts and suggestions, but nothing clicked. I begged for him to stop, demanded that he must. I tried everything, but he refused to listen. He was bent on one single, undeterred thought of destruction. It became clear to me that I couldn't influence his thoughts. Within the depths of his mindset, he had an unshakable foundation that would reject anything of suggestion or logic. That much I could tell. But what I had not attempted yet was to change the world he saw from the outside. It was my only hope. I fell onto the ground and was crawling frantically back from my father, who was bent over, trying to reach down and grab my kicking feet. The sound of the front door opening could be heard, and he shot back up, looking over out into the kitchen at the possible intruder. The noise of the opening door was not part of my planning, and I barely registered it myself, but knowing that my father now looked for somebody opened up an opportunity that would make it all too easy to convince a paranoid mindset. I reached out with my mind. I had to find a solution to this. Who would be possibly entering the house at this hour? I began to form an image, but kept it in reserve. When my father went into the kitchen, he grabbed the short steak knife from the counter and looked around the dark room as though he knew exactly who he was looking for. Somebody who blended into the night. One who could stalk the shadows out of sight. I got up from the ground, breathing frantically and in exhaustion. "Dad, stop," I asked. "Please put down the knife." I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run at that moment, but I didn't know what he would do, or if he'd chase after me with greater vigor. As I watched my father ignore my words and slash at the shadows in the kitchen, I knew I had to do something. I had to stop him. I let out the image. My sister screamed from behind my father, and he turned immediately, plunging the blade from his hand through her chest. His hand snapped back as the blade sparked off the front of the fridge, and he realized she was never there. His sight returned to reality, and he battered at the heavy fridge in front of him with aggravated frustration. "God damn your tricks!" he shouted, turning his attention back to me. "What the hell are you, boy?" My father screamed feverishly as he chased me back into the living room, knowing his delusions were a result of my will. He showed no remorse over having intentionally struck at what he thought was my sister. He was lost. There was nothing left of him. No human could perform such an action without a feeling of guilt. "I knew you had a way with things. Always had that stupid thing your mother said you'd have. That stupid dream that she always wanted. Damn it. You took her away from me." He grabbed a hold of my ankle, and I screeched at his touch. In one sweeping pull, he brought me under his legs, and his dark, furious eyes stared upon me, and I squirmed to get out from under him. My heart was palpitating in fear, as I sensed an unnatural sense of hatred on the surface of my father's thoughts. He wanted me dead. He wanted to extinguish my life, and there was nothing that would stop him. My father let out a curse and then seized my throat with his hands, surging veins pulsating beneath the flesh of his arms, as he applied all his strength into the fingers that clenched my life in their grips. A hollowed emptiness opened up within my chest, and a great coldness wove its way around my ribcage. I tried to scream, but my father's hands were too tight around my throat, and not a single word could escape. I kicked as much as I could, grabbed his wrists with all my strength, but he was stronger than I, far stronger, and no matter what I did, I could not stop him. He tried to kill me, and the world before me vanished in an instant. She lunged at me from the darkness, wrapping her long, sleek hands around my throat exactly as he had. I had to relive the terrible moment of being attacked, but now by my other parent, and she pierced her sharpened nails into my throat, while she howled a screech as though in her death throes. I was thrown back a great distance and crashed to the transparent ground. I was more resistant to pain here, and was thankful for my temporary rest from the living world. As I laid on my back, gasping for the breath that escaped the porous holes torn into my throat, she appeared before me again. "You should have never made that deal. Never!" she screamed, as the air around her shivered violently at her words. I crawled back, feeling immense pressure growing around my throat, as though somebody was still trying to choke me to death. I gripped at hands that weren't there, as building pressure threatened to suffocate me. Looking around frantically, I found myself in complete darkness. There was nothing to see, only she remained. "What did I tell you about asking for things? They should never be granted." "I didn't ask for anything," I shouted in terror. My words were hollow and I was breathing heavily, as though there was not much oxygen in the air. I felt death gripping at me, and I didn't have time to be in this world.
"You made a deal. You wanted it all gone away and you agreed to it. Now he has my pawn in his hands and he's killing you."
She spun around. Her long dress of shrouded shadows blew outward in her rapid motion. A weak and fragile body was revealed underneath. Something had told me that she was dying, that my actions were costing her dearly, that her shadowy robes were slipping away, that my impending death was bringing her down, and that it cost her dearly to sustain my life.
"You cannot die. You are not ready. The world has yet to boil, the ground has yet to curdle, and your birth of despair has yet to plague the world."
She stepped over me, reaching out with a dark and cold hand as I laid back, unable to breathe.
"This is your final chance,"
she warned me before plummeting her hand into my chest.
"I will not let you die. Not this time."
Icy tendrils curled around the inside of my rib cage as I coughed frantically, blowing out gusts of freezing air from my lungs, and the roiling pressure of the growing cold surged outward, demanding an escape. My throat had expanded in order to release the escaping air that previously was never there, despite my father's fingers squeezing down hard onto my windpipe. He turned his face to avoid breathing in the cold air that bellowed out of my throat. My every breath was chilling, and I spat out gusts of air as though the temperature of the room was that of an Arctic continent.
"Will you just die for me?"
my father shouted, picking me up by my throat and slamming me onto the ground. I gasped for breath and watched as ghastly wind currents swirled around the room and over my father, who took no notice of them. His body had small, vapor streams weaving out of the top of his scalp, and their heat was whisked away by the freezing breeze that blew in from all directions. The air continued to form into murky clouds, until they spiraled like a storm and then rushed past my father's head, plunging into my shallowed lungs, filling me with a frigid air. My father's fingers tightened as his fury grew to even greater heights as he watched my life return to me with no possible explanation, a defiance to all logical boundaries. His fingers felt like hot coals pressing against my throat as he tried to deter my resurrection, showing no alarm over my unexplainable return. Pressing my palms together, I felt the currents of cold air gathering in between them. Then what should have been uncomfortable gathering of frost wove in the seams of my fingers, and promised a great sense of liberation, if only I just called to them. After feeling a sudden surge of omnipotence, I turned my hands outward and crashed their frozen forms into my father's chest. Like the combustion of high-pressured water, he blew off of me and flew into the far wall of the living room. My father had fallen onto a houseplant and shattered ceramic base into pieces as he stumbled to pick himself up, dazed from the unnatural blow that occurred. "What the fuck?" my father remarked, before charging back at me, fearless even in the sight of supernatural energies that swirled around me. His exclamation told me that he was able to understand the unusualness behind what had happened, but his actions didn't seem to care. He was unable. I leapt over the couch with an inhuman grace, diving through a narrow opening that led into the kitchen. My father, unable to fit through the small viewing port in the wall, ran the length of the living room to an opening entryway that led into the kitchen. He stumbled onto the tiled floors as he tried to ignore the pain from a fractured rib that occurred as a result of my blow. I kicked a stool, flinging it through the air at my father's head, who had ducked out of the way at the last moment and looked back in the direction of the stool. He heard it shatter into shards of ice as it came into contact with the wall. He stopped for a moment, shaking his head in denial at the remains of the stool. I clutched at my chest as a piercing coldness jabbed into my lungs, and thin sheets of ice were growing up my arms. My heart felt like it was a sculpture of ice, and my every thought was bent on stripping the hope from every living creature. Though I was in possession of my mind, it seemed unusually attracted by the idea of dismay.
"I knew there was something wrong with you from the very beginning. You were a curse the moment you were born, the moment you had killed your mother," my father shouted,
slowly stepping his way over to me, picking up the blade he had previously jabbed into the fridge from the floor. "I will kill you, freak!" He dived at me. I swiftly dodged him, kicking the blade from his fingers, and watched as he grabbed at his broken hand, which turned a dark purple from having made contact with my foot. He suffered instantaneous frostbite, and his limb turned into a blackish death. I slowly backed away as my father dawned upon the realization that he could never use that hand again. It had died in an instant, and was no longer a functional part of him. I was busy convincing myself that he would soon stop. He'd either stop in sight of the futile attempts to seize me, or he'd just tire out completely. I did not want to hurt him, even knowing he was bent on my death. He wasn't himself. Something unusual had come over him, and I had to figure out what exactly it was. But how long I myself could remain like this, I did not know. Every breath I drew in grew colder, and the ice slowly hardened around my heart, slowing its every beat. "You fucking goddamn brat, what the hell brought you into this world?" my father screamed, his anger reaching a height that threatened to strip him of his own life. No heart could remain under such furious pressure, and the wounds I inflicted on him only drove him into deeper rage. He got up and started walking to me, clutching his blue and limp wrist with his only working hand. As I backed away, ice leached from my feet onto the ground around me, making a skating rink of the kitchen floor, and my father's feet were slipping out from under him. He used the cabinets as a brace, guiding himself slowly over the ice in my direction. He curled his lips back in a vicious snarl as he stared into my eyes. "You will die by my hands," he grunted. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, clamping my hands together, feeling their cold surface conjuring outer-worldly elements. "You had brought this on yourself," was all my father had said. And I knew he was lost. Wherever my father had gone, he had not returned, and whatever now stood before me was something else entirely. I finally realized it couldn't have been him. It was nothing like him. Though it rambled of the past memories of his life as though it had lived them itself, it was not my father. This I was certain. It was simply wearing his skin. I stopped holding back. The cabinets opened and every kitchen knife slid out from its holder and lifted from the surface of the counters. They circulated over my head before forming a dance shield of death before me, threatening any approaching hostiles with their sharp edges. They gleamed as their surfaces iced over and became a part of my terrible aura. My father stopped and watched the blades' astonishing display of alacrity, dancing through the air on their own accord, without a guiding hand to instruct them. "There is something wrong with you, boy," he said, looking up at the blades, as they came to a stop, their tips aimed directly at him. It was the first time since he had returned that his anger had completely receded, and in its place was only fear. Whatever was in control of him had left him in that final moment, and his life force, suppressed by his lifelong abuse of drugs, had returned, only long enough to say one word. "She was right, all along." My father's eyes glazed over in ice. The blades fired across the room, embedding themselves into his chest, piercing through his flesh with icy ease. His ribs cracked under the pressures of the larger and heavier butcher knives, while the thin, sleek trimmers wedged in between the bones to strike at his vital organs. My father's life had vanished within a second, hardly long enough for me to register his words, and his body shattered the ice that had gathered on the floor below him. His blood froze over moments after it gushed out of the open wounds inflicted by the blades wedged deeply into his chest. Without a second thought, I knew he was dead. My limbs became heavy and their movements slowed to a dramatic stillness as the ice threatened to encapsulate me into an immovable chamber. Tears would not flow as they were locked behind my eyes like seamless crystals, and the walls of the house slowly froze over as my thoughts were vanishing into a misty condensation. I had reached for my necklace and touched its warm surface. All the ice had shattered in a single loud explosion. The shards fell from the walls, clashing into pools of water, as my limbs were freed and warmth returned to my lungs. I fell to my knees in exhaustion, and breathed in the relieving warm air that took over the house. A terrible, coppery scent lingered in the air. I looked over at my father as his face was frozen in place. The anger in his eyes remained. Even in death, he was cursed by the raging tides of fury. I slid across the floor over to his side and rested my hands over his blood-soaked body, trying to feel what energies might be left. All of it was gone. All of it had faded, disappeared into a world beyond sight. He was a hollowed shell that had been wrought of everything that was inside. It was the first time I had ever seen somebody die. The first time I had ever felt the emptiness that surrounded a desolate body. It was the first time I had ever killed somebody, and I was not enjoying the moment. I sat there, by the side of my fallen father, strangely dispassionate over the whole thing. As much as he was my father, I had hardly got to know him. We had rarely done anything together, never having found the common bond that fell between a father and his son. Beyond the fact that he supplied a simple house, bedding, and food for me, I had never looked to my father for anything else, and I could hardly register the significance of his death. I had killed him, and the driving force that had willed me to do so had since abandoned me, placing me in the midst of a morbid setting that was too much for me to take. I tried to close my eyes and cast the thoughts outside of my mind, but I knew that it could not be denied, that it all had really happened, and that this was not a dream. The angels told me everything. Looking down at my necklace, the dormant angels spoke of the reality of the situation, and it was then that I knew I had to make things right again. I tried to enter, to see if there was a soul, a world I could change, an earth that I could heal, but there was nothing. It all had been gone. I sat back and retracted my blood-stained hands from my father's blood-gorged chest and placed them on my knees as I rested onto my legs. It was over. I had killed my father, and he would never return. I had heard it all my life, but now I had come to realize it. It was all because of me. A quick flint of awe had resounded from the corner of the house, and I knew I was not alone. A mind that was perfected in the arts of concealment, that remained silent when facing with spontaneous emotions, had betrayed its presence in the sight of such astonishing unrealism. By giving into such a dramatic impression, even if only by such a minor degree, the life had revealed to me its presence in the room. I turned to him. He had long black hair that reached down past his shoulders, concealing his head in its dark, reflective shadow. In the same colored blackness, he wore a long, leathery trench coat with deep pockets, where he buried his hands that clutched to horrifying weapons, as he was unexpected of what I would do next. He stared into my eyes, as he refused to feel anything. Not a single emotion would draw over him, not fear, not terror, nor wonder. He stood blank. His mind had been trained to feel the cold emptiness of apathy, and despite the shocking display that had unfolded before him, his mind remained silent, for the most part. I looked back down at my father, knowing exactly what that man had come here to do. It started to make sense. The ramblings my father was saying, the reason he was late from returning home. He was being hunted, and this man was the hunter. But I could find nothing else in the shadows of his fathomless mind. I had taken his kill, but he did not care, only that the job was done. "What do I do?" I asked aloud. "You do what I do," the man spoke, in a deep, resounding voice, void of all emotion. "You run."